The first signs were not armies. They were absences, villages that no longer answered messengers, roads that carried no caravans, border outposts that sent riders eastward and received nothing in return. In the early months of 1241, across the fractured lands of Eastern Europe, information did not arrive as news. It arrived as silence. At first, it was dismissed. Europe had seen invasions before, raids from steppe nomads, incursions by Cumans and Pechenegs. These were familiar threats, violent but limited, bound by geography and season. They came, they plundered, and they withdrew. No one yet understood at this time. The pattern had already broken. Beyond the Carpathians, the kingdoms of Rus had already collapsed. Cities like Kiev, once centers of trade, culture, and political gravity, had been systematically dismantled, not sacked in the traditional sense, but erased. Survivors spoke of forces that did not negotiate, did not occupy, and did not linger. They destroyed resistance, reorganized movement, and advanced again with mechanical certainty. Still, distance softened the urgency. To the courts of Poland, Bohemia, and the Holy Roman Empire, these reports felt distorted by fear. Numbers grew in the telling. Armies became impossibly large. Victories became impossibly total. The idea that an unknown force could sweep through entire regions without slowing, this challenged not just intelligence, but belief. Yet there was one detail that remained consistent: speed. Wherever these armies appeared, they arrived sooner than expected and left nothing capable of resisting behind them. The political landscape of Central Europe in 1241 was not prepared for coherence. Poland was not a unified kingdom in the modern sense. It was divided among regional dukes, each guarding their own territory, each accustomed to acting independently. Authority was fragmented, loyalties conditional. Coordination required time, and time was precisely what the approaching threat denied. At the center of this fractured system stood Henry II the Pious, Duke of Silesia. He was not the most powerful ruler in Europe, nor did he command the largest army. But he possessed something increasingly rare in this moment: clarity. Henry understood that the reports from the east were not exaggerated. They were incomplete. He began gathering forces, not just from Silesia, but from across the Polish duchies. Knights, levies, mercenaries. He reached out to neighboring powers, Bohemia, the Teutonic Order, even distant rulers whose interests might align with survival. His aim was not conquest, nor expansion. It was consolidation. But consolidation required agreement. And agreement moved slowly. Each noble weighed risk against obligation. Each commander questioned the scale of the threat. Was this truly an existential invasion, or another raid that would dissipate on its own? Committing forces meant exposing one's own lands. Delaying meant uncertainty. Meanwhile, the eastern horizon remained silent. The Mongols did not operate within this hesitation. Their campaign into Europe was not spontaneous. It was a continuation of a system already proven across continents. Under the leadership of generals like Subutai, Mongol strategy emphasized coordination across vast distances, precise intelligence gathering, and synchronized movement. This was not a single army advancing blindly westward. It was multiple forces, moving along separate axes, designed to fragment and isolate opposition before decisive engagement. Each column understood not just its objective, but the broader structure of the campaign. Communication was constant. Adaptation was immediate. By early 1241, one such force had already entered Poland. Its size, by later estimates, was around 18,000 men. But numbers alone did not define its strength. Each Mongol soldier operated as part of a highly disciplined system. Units were structured in decimal formations, tens, hundreds, thousands, allowing flexibility without losing cohesion. Command was decentralized enough to react instantly, yet unified enough to execute complex maneuvers across miles of terrain. They did not march as European armies marched. They flowed. Each warrior carried multiple horses, allowing for continuous movement without exhausting their mounts. Supplies were minimal, drawn from the land or prearranged through intelligence networks. Their archery, practiced from childhood, allowed them to strike accurately at distances where European forces could not respond effectively. Most critically, they understood their enemy. Before any major engagement, Mongol scouts had already mapped roads, rivers, settlements, and likely assembly points for European forces. They knew where resistance might form and how to prevent it from becoming unified. Their goal in Poland was not to conquer territory. It was to disrupt coordination. The first clashes were deliberate. Mongol detachments struck smaller towns, border defenses, and isolated units. These attacks were not random acts of violence, but calculated probes. Each engagement tested response times, communication lines, and patterns of movement among European defenders. When resistance formed, the Mongols withdrew, not in defeat, but in design. They created the impression of vulnerability, of a force unwilling to stand and fight. European commanders, accustomed to opponents who either held ground or fled entirely, interpreted these withdrawals as weakness. They began to pursue. Henry II faced a narrowing window. Reports confirmed that Mongol forces had entered deeper into Polish territory, striking with precision and vanishing before concentrated resistance could form. Cities were being bypassed or isolated. Roads were no longer secure. If he waited for full coordination with Bohemian forces under King Wenceslaus, he risked allowing the Mongols to continue dismantling the region piece by piece. If he advanced alone, he risked confronting an enemy he did not fully understand. This was not a choice between safety and danger. It was a choice between two forms of uncertainty. Henry chose to move. His army began to assemble near the town of Liegnitz, modern-day Legnica. For European standards, it was substantial. Estimates vary, but contemporary and near-contemporary accounts place the combined forces, Polish knights, local levies, and allied contingents at numbers that could approach or exceed 100,000 when including non-combatants and support elements. Even conservative estimates suggest a force far larger than the Mongol detachment operating in the region, but size did not guarantee cohesion. The army was composed of different groups with varying levels of training, discipline, and command structure. Knights operated under feudal obligations, often accompanied by their own retinues. Infantry units were less standardized, drawn from local populations with limited battlefield experience. Command, while nominally under Henry II, required coordination across these layers. And coordination required clarity. Yet clarity was precisely what the Mongols intended to deny. As Henry advanced, reports reached him of Mongol forces nearby, small groups, visible, seemingly vulnerable. Scouts confirmed their presence. The enemy appeared fragmented, operating in dispersed units rather than a unified army. This aligned with expectations. A raiding force, stretched thin, vulnerable to concentrated attack. The opportunity seemed clear. Engage quickly, overwhelm locally, prevent further destruction. But the information Henry received was incomplete. What he could not see were the movement beyond his immediate horizon, the positioning of other Mongol units, the coordination between detachments, the deliberate shaping of the battlefield before he even arrived. The Mongols were not retreating. They were drawing him in. The terrain around Liegnitz offered both opportunity and risk. Open fields allowed for cavalry maneuver, favoring the heavily armored knights who formed the core of European offensive power. But these same fields also provided space for the kind of fluid movement that Mongol tactics relied upon: rapid repositioning, feigned retreats, and encirclement. Visibility was limited by slight elevations and terrain undulations. Dust, kicked up by movement, could obscure formations. Communication relied on banners, horns, and messengers, methods effective under controlled conditions, but vulnerable to disruption in fast-moving engagements. The battlefield was not neutral. It would amplify whichever side imposed its structure first. By early April, the convergence was inevitable. Henry's forces moved toward Liegnitz, aiming to intercept what they believed to be a fragmented Mongol presence. At the same time, Mongol units maneuvered to concentrate at a point of their choosing, just beyond immediate detection, but close enough to engage on favorable terms. Neither side entered the coming battle by accident, but only one side had shaped its conditions in advance. On the eve of engagement, the imbalance was not visible in numbers. It was embedded in preparation. Henry's army stood as a symbol of European resistance, large, determined, and anchored in traditions of warfare that had defined centuries of conflict. Heavy cavalry, decisive charges, personal valor. Victory achieved through direct confrontation and overwhelming force. The Mongols represented something different. Not just a new enemy, but a new system of war. One that prioritized information over assumption, movement over position. Manipulation over confrontation. As dawn approached on April 9th, 1241, these two systems prepared to meet, but they were not meeting on equal terms. One side believed it was about to engage a retreating enemy. The other had already decided how the battle would unfold. And in the stillness before the first movement, before the first charge, before the first arrow was released, the outcome was already beginning to take shape. Morning did not arrive with clarity. It came through a haze, low, drifting dust that blurred the horizon in flattened distance. From the vantage points available to Henry II's army, the landscape appeared unsettled, its edges indistinct. Movement could be seen, but not measured. Shapes formed and dissolved at the limits of vision. This was the first condition of the battlefield. Uncertainty. European forces advanced in structure formations, as doctrine required. The core of their strength, heavily armored knights, held forward positions, supported by infantry contingents arranged behind or between cavalry elements. Banners marked units. Signals were prepared. The expectation was simple: locate the enemy, engage decisively, and break them through concentrated force. But the enemy did not present itself in a fixed line. Instead, Mongol units appeared in fragments. Small cavalry groups moved across the field, maintaining distance, never committing to a stationary position. They did not advance to meet the European formation. They circled it, probing, observing, adjusting. Arrows began to fall, not in volleys designed to overwhelm, but in measured sequences intended to test reaction. The range was unexpected. Mongol composite bows, shorter than European longbows but more powerful when used from horseback, allowed accurate fire while in motion. Arrows reached targets at distances where return fire was ineffective. The effect was not immediate destruction, but pressure, constant, unrelenting pressure. Henry's commanders interpreted the initial contact through familiar logic. The enemy was avoiding direct engagement. This suggested weakness, or at least hesitation. If the Mongols refused to close the distance, they could be forced into it. The solution, as understood within European doctrine, was to advance aggressively, compress space, and deny the enemy freedom of movement. Orders were given. Cavalry units began to move forward, maintaining formation at first, but accelerating as the distance closed. The expectation was that the Mongol forces, once pressed, would either stand and fight or break entirely. They did neither. They withdrew, but their withdrawal was controlled, measured, consistent, never chaotic. They maintained cohesion even as they retreated, continuing to fire arrows backward over their shoulders with practiced precision. This was not flight. It was extension. The European advance intensified. At the front, individual knights began to separate from the larger formation, not through disobedience, but through momentum. The speed of mounted advance, combined with the desire to close with a retreating enemy, created gaps. Units stretched. Alignment shifted. What had begun as a coordinated push started to fragment into faster-moving elements and slower supports. The Mongols responded immediately. Their retreat adjusted in pace, drawing the leading European cavalry further from the main body. Distance expanded, not just between the two armies, but within the European force itself. This was the second condition of the battlefield. Separation. Henry's position, slightly behind the forward elements, limited his ability to see the full development. Signals were sent, horns, banners, but the growing distance and rising dust reduced their clarity. Messages took longer to reach their targets. Interpretation varied. What one unit understood as controlled advance, another perceived as an opportunity for decisive engagement. The Mongols continued to shape this perception. They allowed certain units to come closer, then pulled away again. At times, they appeared to falter, slowing just enough to suggest vulnerability. Each hesitation invited pursuit. Each pursuit extended the European line further. Arrows continued to fall. Horses began to suffer first. Unarmored or lightly protected, they presented easier targets. A wounded horse disrupted not just its rider, but the formation around it. Momentum broke. Gaps widened. Riders dismounted, or were thrown, or struggled to maintain control. The psychological effect accumulated. The enemy could not be reached, and yet they inflicted damage continuously. At a critical moment, a segment of the European cavalry surged ahead. Whether driven by misinterpreted signals or local initiative, this group accelerated beyond the supporting line, closing distance with what appeared to be a withdrawing Mongol detachment. For a brief interval, it seemed that contact would finally be made on European terms. The Mongols allowed it. They slowed just enough. The leading knights charged, and then the battlefield changed. From beyond the visible horizon, positions previously concealed by terrain and distance, additional Mongol units emerged, not in disorder, but in coordination. They moved laterally, cutting across the path of the advancing European cavalry. What had appeared to be a single retreating force was, in fact, a component of a larger structure. The withdrawing units now pivoted, altering direction. The newly revealed forces closed from the sides. The European vanguard, now extended and partially isolated, found itself engaged from multiple angles. This was not encirclement in the immediate sense. It was containment. Henry's forward units attempted to adjust. Knights turned to face the new threats, attempting to reorient formation under pressure. But reorientation required space, and space was being systematically reduced. Arrows intensified, now delivered from multiple directions. Horses, already strained, became increasingly difficult to control. Communication broke down further. Signals from the rear could not reach the front with clarity. Units acted on local perception, not centralized command. Some pressed forward, believing breakthrough was imminent. Others attempted to withdraw, recognizing the shift in engagement. The line no longer existed as a unified structure. It existed as fragments. At this stage, the Mongols introduced a new element. Smoke. A count from a battle described the use of devices that produced thick, obscuring clouds, likely mixtures designed to create both visual and respiratory disruption. Whether deployed through simple incendiaries or more specialized means, the effect was immediate. Visibility collapsed. The already limited clarity of the battlefield was replaced by confusion. Units lost sight of one another. Direction became uncertain. Sound, hoofbeats, shouts, horns, echoed without clear origin. In this environment, control became nearly impossible. But the Mongols did not lose control. Their units, trained to operate within decentralized command structures, continued to execute coordinated movements. Prearranged signals, familiarity with terrain, and disciplined response allowed them to maintain cohesion even within obscure conditions. The European forces, reliant on visibility and centralized signals, could not. This was the third condition of the battlefield. Disorientation. Henry's position grew increasingly precarious. Reports reached him, fragmented, contradictory. Some units claimed progress. Others signaled distress. The scale of the engagement was no longer clear. The enemy's true strength remained uncertain. What was clear was that the initial assumption that the Mongols were retreating had collapsed. The engagement was no longer pursuit. It was a struggle for coherence. Attempts were made to reinforce the forward elements. Additional cavalry units advanced, seeking to stabilize the situation, to reconnect fragmented groups and restore a unified front. But these reinforcements entered the same conditions: limited visibility, disrupted communication, and a battlefield already shaped by the enemy. They did not restore order. They extended the area of confusion. The Mongols adapted continuously. Where resistance stiffened, they withdrew slightly, drawing units further into exposed positions. Where gaps appeared, they exploited them immediately, inserting fast-moving cavalry to isolate smaller groups. Their objective was not to crush the European army in a single blow. It was to dissolve it, piece by piece, unit by unit. By midday, the battle had lost any resemblance to a conventional engagement. There was no clear front line, no stable formation, no singular point of decision. Instead, the field was defined by localized struggles, clusters of knights attempting to regroup, infantry units holding uncertain positions, isolated commanders trying to interpret a situation that no longer followed recognizable patterns. The Mongols remained in motion, always just beyond decisive contact, always applying pressure, always reshaping the battlefield. Their arrows did not need to kill in large numbers. They needed to prevent recovery. At the center of this shifting conflict, Henry II faced a narrowing set of options. To withdraw required coordination that no longer existed. To advance required clarity that could not be obtained. To hold position required a stable line that had already dissolved. Each possible decision was constrained by conditions already established by the enemy. This was not the moment of defeat, but it was a moment where defeat became structurally possible. As the engagement continued, the cumulative effects became irreversible. Fatigue set in among men and horses alike. Armor, designed for short bursts of decisive combat, became a burden over extended movement. Heat, exertion, and stress reduced effectiveness. Units that might have reformed under calmer conditions found themselves unable to do so. The Mongols did not experience these constraints in the same way. Their lighter equipment, multiple mounts, and rotational tactics allowed sustained engagement without comparable exhaustion. Where European forces degraded over time, Mongol forces maintained operational tempo. Time itself became a weapon. By the later stages of the battle, the European army was no longer a single entity. It was a collection of disconnected elements, each reacting to immediate threats without awareness of the broader situation. And within that fragmentation, the Mongols began to tighten their control, not through a single decisive strike, but through the steady elimination of the possibility of recovery. The turning point had not yet been reached, but the conditions that would make it inevitable were already in place. And as the dust settled in uneven layers across the field of Liegnitz, obscuring both ground and horizon, the structure of Henry's army was no longer intact. What remained was movement without cohesion, resistance without coordination, and a battlefield that no longer belonged to those who had marched onto it expecting control. By the final phase of the battle, the conflict at Liegnitz no longer resembled two armies meeting in war. It had become a disintegration under sustained pressure, where command, once the backbone of European resistance, could no longer reach the men it was meant to guide. Henry II's forces were still present across the field, but presence no longer meant unity. Fragments of cavalry and infantry continued to fight in isolated pockets, each group responding only to what they could immediately see. The Mongols, maintaining their operational pattern, did not seek a single decisive clash. Instead, they concentrated force where resistance briefly stabilized, then withdrew before becoming fixed in place. It was a method designed not to meet strength, but to exhaust it. As the afternoon progressed, the collapse of coordination became irreversible. The European army's greatest advantage, heavy cavalry shock, could no longer be applied effectively. Charges that might have broken a conventional line instead dissolved into scattered engagements. Horses, already exhausted and wounded, could not sustain repeated assaults. Knights found themselves fighting in small clusters, often without awareness of neighboring units. Henry II attempted to reassert control, but the battlefield no longer transmitted authority. Signals were lost in distance, smoke, and chaos. Messengers failed to return. Orders could not propagate through the fractured formation quickly enough to matter. What remained was reaction, not command. At a critical moment, Henry's forces attempted a final consolidation. A group of knights formed what remained of a coherent strike force and attempted to push through a concentration of Mongol units. For a brief interval, the movement created pressure in one sector of the battlefield. It appeared, momentarily, that a breakthrough might be achieved, but the Mongols did not meet the charge directly. They opened space, then closed it from the sides. The attack lost momentum before it could become decisive, and once momentum was gone, it could not be recovered. Henry II himself was drawn into the collapsing center of the engagement. Accounts indicate that his formation was gradually isolated from the larger body of the army. Whether through deliberate targeting or battlefield fragmentation, the effect was the same. His position became surrounded by smaller, mobile enemy units that avoided direct confrontation while maintaining pressure. In the struggle to re-establish cohesion, Henry was killed. His death did not end the battle immediately, but it removed the last symbolic anchor of unified command. After his fall, the remaining structure of resistance dissolved further. What followed was not a rout in the traditional sense, but a complete breakdown of organized resistance. Groups attempted to retreat toward safer terrain, but withdrawal under pressure proved as difficult as engagement. The Mongols maintained pursuit in controlled measures, never overextending, always preserving mobility. Isolated groups were cut off, absorbed, or dispersed. The battlefield ceased to function as a single space of decision. It became a series of separations. By the time the fighting diminished, the outcome was no longer in doubt. European forces had been fragmented beyond recovery. Losses were significant not only in lives, but in structure. Knights, commanders, and infantry who might have been reorganized in another context were scattered or destroyed in isolated encounters. The Mongols did not remain to occupy the field. They withdrew as they had arrived, rapidly, systematically, without the need for symbolic victory. Their objective had never been territory at Liegnitz. It had been disruption, elimination of resistance, and continuation of the wider campaign westward. The psychological impact of Liegnitz extended far beyond the battlefield itself. For European observers, the engagement represented something difficult to fully integrate into existing military understanding. A force smaller in number had not merely defeated a larger one, it had dismantled it through control of movement, perception, and cohesion. It challenged assumptions about armor, courage, and numerical superiority, and it exposed a new form of warfare already established by the Mongol system. In the aftermath, the region of Silesia stood exposed. The defeat removed a major assembled force intended to halt the invasion. Coordination between regional powers weakened further. Fear spread faster than organized response. The Mongol advance continued into neighboring territories with reduced resistance. Yet Liegnitz was not an isolated event. It was part of a wider campaign that demonstrated a consistent pattern: fragmentation of enemy forces before decisive engagement, and destruction through controlled mobility rather than static confrontation. Historically, the battle remained significant not for its scale alone, but for what it revealed. It marked one of the clearest encounters between two fundamentally different military systems: the European feudal model, built on armored shock and localized command, and the Mongol operational model, built on intelligence, mobility, and psychological pressure. At Liegnitz, those differences did not merely clash.